Hey, all you Feminerds out there, this is Becca.
And this is Leigh.
And we are excited to bring you a new episode of File 741 today. We're going to be talking about two different graphic novels that were both published by First Second. And the first one is called Bloom by Kevin Panetta and Savannah Ganuccio. I hope I'm pronouncing those correctly. But Leah's going to give us a little synopsis of what the story is about, and we'll delve in to talk about it.
Okay, so Bloom, this is a recent one. I believe it just came out in 2019. So basically this story is about a boy named Ari. He recently graduated high school and is spending his summer working for his parents' struggling bakery, even though it's not at all what he wants to be doing. He longs to move to the city with his friends and the band that they have, and he dreams of going to college for music. Hector is staying at his late Nana's house and is starting to clean it out so he can sell it. He loves to bake, so he applies to work at the bakery as a side job. As Ari trains him to eventually be his replacement, they grow closer. With time, their friendship grows into more. Unfortunately, the night they finally admit their feelings for each other, they get distracted and an accident happens. Ari accidentally leaves a towel on the stove while it's on and the door wasn't fully closed, and it catches fire uncontrollably, and the bakery burns down. Thankfully, everyone is safe, but Hector takes the blame for it and loses his job.
What's important to note is that Ari blames him.
True.
Not that Hector specifically takes the blame, although he doesn't argue at the time.
True. So Ari ends up moving to the city with his friends, but is very depressed. He misses home and Hector and feels very guilty, as he should. He decides to go back home and tell his parents the truth. They had insurance, so the bakery is being rebuilt, and Hector is selling his Nana's house and planning to move, so Ari goes to apologize and ask him to stay. They end up making up, and Hector gets his job back at the bakery.
Yeah. So one of the things that's really interesting about this comic are the characters that are developed. Ari is very young and messy and kind of annoying sometimes. Hi, Bailey.
Sorry, we have cat introductions.
She
wants to be part of the podcast as well. So she's our third member.
Yes, and she has a lot to say about these comics.
Clearly.
Anyway, so he's kind of messy, he's kind of annoying, he's very young. Even though he does have this dream to move to the city and be in the band with his friends, he doesn't really work to make that happen. You know, he doesn't really have the motivation to really make it happen, to really convince his friends that this is what he wants to do. At one point, one of his friends, they are talking about all moving, and he said, well, what are you talking about? When did this conversation take place? And they're like, we had it, you just weren't around. Mm-hmm. So even though he's developing this relationship with Hector, it's also taking a toll on his other friendships and the other goals that he thought that he had. And that makes him a very relatable character, especially being 18 years old. You know, when I was 18, I didn't know, I went to college, but I didn't know what I wanted to study. Mm-hmm. It took me a long time to really think about what kind of major I was interested in. I changed it like 4 times. You know, as an 18-year-old, it's really hard to know what to do and what you really want. I think Hector fulfills for him a sense of newness and adventure that I think he wants from living in the city and being in the band, but also a measure of stability. Mm-hmm. Because Hector, of course, I think he's a little bit of a mystery still. We don't really know a lot about his family. Mm-hmm. You know, his Nana died, and so he's in town to take care of the house, but we don't really know why he's on his own, if his parents are just not around to deal with that, anything like that. And so I think that's kind of interesting that we don't necessarily hear as much about him. He's definitely more mature than Ari is.
Yeah, I was wondering if he's maybe older.
Yeah, so I didn't know if they're the same age or if he's a little bit older. And he understandably reacts really strongly when Ari both flakes out on him multiple times and also blames him for the bakery fire. So I think while he enjoys the friendship and the relationship that he's developing with Ari, it's very complicated for him, and it's hard for him to really kind of figure out what he wants from Ari, because, you know, he broke up with his boyfriend because he felt like his boyfriend was too needy and, like, needed too much from him, and that's kind of what Ari is at some points.
True. Very true. So I like this story a lot because I understand what it feels like to grow up somewhere that doesn't interest you and wanting to be free to live elsewhere and do what you love for a living. It's hard when your home doesn't feel like it's right and your family has different expectations for you and your future. Ari's experience really hit home for me. No pun intended. Just like him, I learned to find contentment and purpose in my hometown and career. It's quite freeing once you do finally figure that out and how to be happy with what you have. I haven't found my Hector yet, but maybe one day I'll find her. If not, I can learn to be content being single as well.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that, you know, this comic is messy and complicated, and I think it's very realistic in that way. I just recently read an adult gay romance, and, like, everything was so easy. There was, like, no conflict. Right. There was very, like, little, like, character conflict, but, you know, this guy moves back to his hometown because he had to leave the sports team, and then he and his two brothers are trying to find houses together. They immediately find, like, the perfect houses. He meets this guy. It's, like, the perfect relationship. And I'm like, okay, this isn't interesting because there's nothing really happening. There's no conflict. Right. And so to have a romance have that kind of conflict that feels very realistic, I think is really great. And I think even when Ari and Hector finally get together, which that scene, by the way, is incredibly sexy for a YA book. Like, I was reading it, and just the way it's drawn and illustrated, I was like, wow. This is happening. Yep. Yep. Good for them.
No words even. It was all done through picture. It was really awesome.
Necessary.
Yeah.
But, like, even when that happens, the bakery burns down. So things don't work out perfectly. And so even though it kind of has this happy ending, I think it took a while for things to work out because the very last kind of epilogue happens quite a few months after the main story.
True, which I think is very realistic.
Yeah. And what I liked too is I read this while I was on vacation at the Oregon coast, and I wanted to justify bringing such a thick book on the plane with me in my carry-on, and so I read it very slowly. Usually, you know, a graphic novel I will consume in 1 or 2 sittings because it will only take me an hour or two. But with this, I really took my time, and I really let the story bloom, pun intended. And so it was really interesting to kind of have a more slow development of the story. It was really an interesting way to read it.
Yeah, I took my time with this as well. That's kind of something that I really like about First Second, is that their graphic novels are really long, which is not something that you see all the time with different publishers. But what's nice about that is that it gives you the time to, you know, really elaborate on the story and hit all those points that a lot of other graphic novels miss or just kind of touch upon. So it really becomes much more of a story that way. That's
true. I hadn't really thought about that. You know, sometimes you read something and it feels like things are just getting started right when it's ending.
Right.
So you're right that I think, you know, it definitely is more of an effort to read, but I think, like you said, it really allows for the story to develop naturally and have a natural conclusion. You know, I think too that graphic novels allow for a different art style than a lot of regular comics. You know, there's all sorts of comics, and we've talked about all different kinds, but graphic novels, by their nature, are different than comics that have issues, because with issues you have to like end on a cliffhanger, and you have to
it's a continuing story.
Tell the story differently so that you have continuous readership, where as a graphic novel you can contain the whole story in one book, so you do have a little more license to have the artwork be a little gentler or the story take a little longer. So I think it's really fun to kind of see those differences. I like them both, I think, equally for different reasons. But yeah, I think First Second has done a really great job with the publications that they've put out.
Yes, I totally agree.
So why don't you talk a little bit about the structure of this one in particular and the artwork?
Absolutely. I really love the color scheme of this comic. It's monotone, but it's with variations of teal, which is very soothing to the eye. It takes place in a beach town, so the color scheme helps show the tranquility of the ocean that it's set in. I also think that this is a very creative alternative to grayscale palette. I think if the comic would have been just in grayscale tone, it would have been a very different feel to it, and I'm not so sure I would have connected with it as much as I did with the color that it is now. I also appreciated the layout of the panels. Some panels simply had the sequential rectangles of various sizes like a normal graphic novel would, but other pages had these connecting kind of organic curved shapes. It happened a lot whenever Hector was baking. It would seem to be any time that there was a moment of somebody doing something that was passionate to them, or working together when him and Ari would work together and were bonding. So there was certain pages in particular that were really cool about that. And I can't say that I've ever seen this kind of a layout in a comic before. It was really unique and beautiful and surprisingly easy to follow, even though it wasn't in a traditional manner whatsoever.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. You know, those double page spreads that you're talking about, they're always filled with flowers, so of course their relationship is blooming. The things that they are sharing are, you know, the summer is going on, they are growing closer, and things between them are growing. And I really like that they, like you said, they're very curvy, there's lots of unusual shapes, and it really kind of displays a certain motion to the scenes. But at the same time, you kind of imagine it's like a montage. Like if you were watching this as a film, there'd be like some sweet music in the background as you're kind of watching them share these moments.
Yeah, it was really, really beautiful. I was very taken by the artwork in this one.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like you said, it's very effective. It's very beautiful. I think the teal, bluish tones definitely lends for a cooler, more serious tone. Although I think, you know, the art style is, there's very thick lines. It's a little bit looser and a little more casual. So I think there's a good contrast to there. I think the tone also matches Ari's mood more often than not, because it's a little darker than some other comics that I've read. You know, there are scenes that are definitely brighter and lighter, like in the bakery and things, but there's a lot of scenes at night, there's a lot of scenes kind of in clubs and in dark places that I think kind of match Ari's mood and personality and the things that he's going through as well. Because I think he simultaneously takes things too seriously and then not seriously enough. So he also has that kind of looseness, that kind of flexibility of personality and of spirit. But I think it also supports the slower storytelling and invites a sense of possibility.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That's a great assessment.
I think, too, with the way you were talking about the way the panels are structured, a lot of them are very evenly distributed. It's very kind of a classic kind of layout, not so much as Bandette, you know, that we talked about before. But I think there are ways in which Ari feels like his life is very structured. But when he is with Hector and certain things are happening, that's when it becomes a lot more open and free.
I didn't even notice that. That's awesome.
Yeah, and then I think the character designs too, they're very charming without being cutesy.
Right.
You know, and so they feel like realistic characters. There's a great diverse cast between the two friends between the friends of both Hector and Ari. And they definitely are forces within the two young men's lives, but, you know, of course they're secondary characters to what's happening. But they definitely are interesting and well-developed characters enough. They all have unique personalities, and it makes the world feel very realistic and very honest.
Yeah, all in all, I thought this was a really sweet story, and it warmed my heart and got me baking myself. There's something about baking and love. I don't know what it is.
Well, we were just talking about that. I just read Check Please, which has baking. We talked about Space Battle Lunchtime. There's the other one, the magic one, Moonstruck. What is it with queer characters and baking?
Yeah, that's exactly what I had said. And isn't Brave Chef Brianna another one too? So yeah, I don't know what it is. Something about queer love stories and baking. So maybe we need to center our lives around baking, and then we'll be able to experience something similar. So it seems to be very common in comics right now. So
I don't like to bake, so I don't know how well that's going to work out for me. Well, I think what's really interesting about this story is I don't think it would work in the same way if it had the same color scheme and tone as Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me.
Agreed.
Which is the other novel that we're going to talk about. It's got a very different style. There's similarities in the stories, but the style is completely different. So Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me, which every single time I look at the title, I think it says Laura Dern. And I'm like, ooh, Jurassic Park. But it's not. So it was written by Mariko Tamaki, who did write one of the Lumberjanes. She wrote the Lumberjanes novels, the fiction books.
Cool.
And some other stuff for DC and Marvel. And then it was illustrated by Rosemary Valero O'Connell. Really, really beautiful art style, but again, totally different. And very different from Bloom. So do you want to give us a synopsis of this story?
I would say it's the complete opposite of Bloom, and the tagline is Love Hurts. Yes, it does. So, the lead character is Freddie Riley, and she is in high school. She's openly queer. With a close group of friends. She also has a girlfriend, in quotations, named Laura Dean. Laura Dean doesn't seem to have a lot in common with Freddie and Freddie's friends, who don't seem to like her as well in how she treats Freddie. Laura is popular, very attractive, and she's kind of the school flirt. She doesn't seem to care about or respect Freddie much, or their relationship, because as soon as she gets bored or she gets distracted by another girl, she leaves Freddie in the dust. She takes full advantage of Freddie's kind heart, and no matter how it makes Freddie feel. She feels confused, hurt, and just wants Laura to stop breaking up with her so they can be together. Anytime Freddie starts to see that she doesn't need Laura, Laura comes back and pulls her right back in. She keeps going back to Laura even at the cost of her friendships. And she realizes that she hasn't been there for them because she keeps chasing after Laura. That's her breaking point, and when she finally decides to break up with Laura for good. There's a great quote on page 278 where she says, "You're a shitty girlfriend, but also when I'm with you, I'm a shitty friend, so I'm breaking up with you." Of course, Laura is shocked and tries to make her feel guilty because she's so manipulative. And when she doesn't get her way, she gets angry and screams, "Fuck you," before slamming the door behind Freddie.
Yeah, so quite different.
Yes,
in tone,
just a bit.
In style, in story. For sure, it's definitely another kind of messy sort of relationship, but it ends very differently than, of course, Bloom does. I think Laura is a really good representation of people that we all know. You know, there's people out there who are just super attractive and charming, like stupidly charming, even though you know they're like not necessarily a good person. They just draw people to them. They're magnetic. And it's really difficult to get out of that person's sphere sometimes, especially when they show you attention. It's really hard to be like, no, I don't need this when you want it.
Right.
And so I think, again, Freddie is another character who's kind of messy and unsure. She keeps going back to Laura Dean, even though her rational mind tells her that she shouldn't.
Right.
One of the great things I like about this story is the convention of her sending these emails to the Anna Weiss, the advice columnist that she sends these emails to. It really reminded me of Dear Rachel Maddow, that book by Adrienne Kushner, that has that same kind of idea where I think sometimes in order to understand what's going on with yourself, you have to articulate it to somebody else. Otherwise, you just internalize it and you keep looking inward and you're not thinking about how it affects the people around you.
Right.
So I really liked that idea that she has to be honest with herself before she can mend the relationships that she has broken. So one of the other main characters is her best friend Doodle. And what I love about this character is she's super, super interesting to me. I double-checked today. She's not referred to by her pronouns until the very end, because I wasn't sure what her pronouns were.
Right.
She looks very queer. Like, she doesn't present as cishet female. She's got short hair. She wears glasses and kind of baggy clothes. And her character actually really helped me recognize my own assumptions about queer people, because what ends up happening with Doodle is as Freddie is ignoring her basically to spend time with Laura, she is going to play D&D at this shop. She ends up having an affair with her DM, who is married, and she gets pregnant. And so when that happened, when that plot point was revealed, I was really surprised, because I assumed that Doodle would not have sex with a man. And so that really helped me be like, oh, queerness is living outside of societal norms and like outside of the box in many different ways, and that can look like many different things. And so somebody who doesn't present as female may still be heterosexual, or like not, because if you're non-binary, but she uses she pronouns, so it's not a plot point of like what her identity is and how she identifies. But I think it's really interesting to have that, Freddie and Doodle, a lot of their friends are queer, and so there's just a lot of queerness everywhere. And so to have a relationship that doesn't necessarily look like a normal straight relationship or a normal queer relationship, I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and I wonder if maybe that was done on purpose as a reveal.
Yeah, quite possibly. And I also think all of these choices are deliberate for sure, but I think because Doodle's not the main character, I think it was just another way to show how varied queerness is. So absolutely, I think it was a really interesting choice. And then of course there's Vi, who Freddie meets by puking at her store after the big dance, and Laura's cheating on Freddie again, and she gets wasted, and then goes and meets this very nice person who there's hints of romance there, but I think in general, it's just kind of a good friendship for her to kind of get away from Laura and get away from everything else that's been going on with her.
Yes. In my opinion, it's not easy to leave an abusive or toxic relationship, so Freddie's journey through this story was really important to tell. It's a story of choosing yourself and the people you care about over a toxic relationship, no matter how intoxicating it may be. Unfortunately, I relate to this story a bit too. I know what it's like to pine after someone who doesn't care about you and to become a shitty friend in the process. it takes a lot of self-reflection and strength to leave that behind and to be better for it.
Well, thank you for sharing. I think a lot of us have experienced this in some way.
Yeah.
Whether that's family members that are toxic, whether it's friends, whether it's relationships, whether it's our job. There's a lot of different things that are really hard to recognize when it's not healthy.
Yeah.
Because in some ways you're getting something out of it, but it's really hard to get past. I think there's a lot of earnestness in this story. Mm-hmm. It's got a little bit of the kind of honest whimsy of Lumberjanes, in which the stakes don't feel very high, but they are high, you know, and to the characters, all of this is very important. And I think even though we don't always agree with the decisions that the characters make in Bloom or in Laura Dean, we all recognize this sense of feeling at sea, and we don't know where the land is because these circumstances are so far outside of our experience.
Right.
I was thinking about this, you know, I wrote down that these books are like coming of age stories, but then I was like, you know what, I don't actually like the phrase coming of age because it's so different for so many people. You know, what does that mean? Does it mean something happens to you and then you're of age? Like, do you get to a certain age? You know, there are people who, because of very unfortunate circumstances, grow up very quickly at a very young age. And there are adults in their 50s and 60s and 70s who still act like children. So, you know, I really don't think... I think coming of age stories encapsulate this idea of changing what you know about yourself and how you understand the world, how the world works. But I don't think it's consistent for the necessarily age of the person or what they're going through. So I thought that was really interesting. It's very relatable, but it's different for everybody. You know, we all make mistakes, we all make bad decisions, and we all have to figure out how to repair them, whether that's at 18, whether that's at 16, whether that's at 35, whether that's at 57.
Right.
It happens.
Well, I also think what's really interesting about these is that these are considered YA books. And if you go to your local library, they're actually in the youth section, which part of me is like really surprised because when I was growing up, there was nothing like this. And I feel like this is such a great way of sharing these kinds of important stories to the youth of today, because I mean, I'm sure, just like we both said, you know, we can relate to them, things like this that happened to us. You know, how nice would it have been when we were younger to have had these and been like, oh, I'm not alone. Oh, I'm going through that same thing, you know? And so in some ways, the coming of age part is mostly just finding a voice that seems like, oh, wow, I didn't even realize that that's something that people go through, or I'm going through that right now. I didn't realize that was a thing. Like, I imagine somebody reading Laura Dean and maybe even, like, realizing, oh, wait, I'm in a relationship like that, and maybe I'm doing this, and maybe that's not great. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's more and more research coming out about the human brain, which is so complex and so interesting, but about teen brains and how teens think. And, you know, the part of your brain, the like logical, rational decision-making part of your brain is not fully developed until like your early 20s or something like that. I don't have all of the exact scientific information on that, so go look it up. Don't just trust me. But our teen librarian at the library, we had a discussion about that and how sometimes teens do stupid things, and it's not that they're consciously deciding to disobey rules or, you know, climb up on the table and jump off. Like, they just don't have those kind of decision-making skills developed yet. Right. And so I think it's interesting to really see those sort of things displayed on paper for others to experience and to relate to. And I think as well, I talked about this a while ago, but yeah, YA wasn't really a thing when
Not
we
at
were
all.
growing up. I feel like I went from reading things like Bridge to Terabithia and, you know, the books from the junior section to, like, Lord of the Rings. Like, there was nothing kind of in between to really read. And so now I'm going back and reading a lot of queer YA novels. And it's pretty incredible to me, one, the things that teens have to deal with nowadays that I didn't even think about when I was a kid. I didn't have a cell phone till I was in college. So, like,
Right.
you know, I didn't have to think about that. But also the very honest way that these authors talk about sex. Because, you know, sex education has been this battle forever. But research has shown that teens are going to have sex. Like, it doesn't really matter what you tell them. The most important thing is to talk to them about doing it safely.
Right.
And so, you know, reading these books, I'm like, wow, like, these teens are having sex in these books, and they're not explicit sex scenes because they're between teens, and, you know, there's adult books for that. But it really is very honest, and I think it's really important that teens have a place to go to talk about those things when they may not feel safe talking to their parents, especially if it's queer related, if they're not out or if they're exploring or experimenting. It's nice for them to have literature that explores those things so that they're not doing things specifically unsafely. There's examples.
I agree, and that would be also something that I would have appreciated when I was of that age. I did go through the traditional sex ed in, like, 5th grade or something like that, but once again, nothing queer.
Right.
So, you know,
it's all penis and vagina.
Yeah, so it's just very, I don't know, it's interesting. I'm happy that these things exist now, because I think that it makes things much more honest for people who are searching for answers.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the artwork and the structure of this comic. I really liked it. Again, very different from Bloom. It actually reminded me a little bit of Flat Track Furies.
Yes,
because
I thought the same.
It's got a grayscale background, basically, and then there's these highlights of this kind of orangey pink tone.
Very bright pink.
That is not consistent based on, like, what it's highlighting. Like, Flat Track Furies was very much the derby players were the ones that had the pink highlights, so you could kind of really pick them out from everything else that was going on. This has very specific but varied choices of what is highlighted.
And sometimes it's very small and subtle, like it's just somebody's straw.
Yeah.
You know, so I mean, it's this big, huge panel, but the only thing that's pink in it is this one straw. So I'm curious what the artist was thinking when they were doing it, you know, if it was just a way to, like, just make the eye lead through the story, because I do think that's effective.
Yeah. By
having the highlights, it really does help the panels flow well. But yeah, I'm just kind of curious how they decided what parts were pink and what parts weren't. Sometimes they're very obvious, and other times they're very random.
Yeah, and I wonder too if they experimented with that and highlighted different things.
Right.
Because I think too, it may not have been so much a conscious choice as it was like, let's do this and see how it feels. And you know, when you do that sometimes and you're like, oh no, like, I can't articulate why this is not working, but it's not working. But then you do something else and you're like, oh yeah, this totally works. Or if they experimented too with different colors.
Right. Yeah, I wondered that as well.
Yeah, the kind of pink orangey kind of tone to me, because it's bright, but it's not like neon pink,
right?
Like what I would think of like a highlighter, and it's almost
a peach.
Yeah, it kind of lends a kind of twilight kind of feeling. Like, even from the beginning, you know, things are fading.
Right.
So I think, you know, I mean, the very first thing that happens is they're at this dance and Laura ditches Freddie. So I think even from the start, you know that things aren't necessarily, like, super cheerful.
Right.
Which I think that specific color helps highlight.
Well, and what's interesting, too, unlike Bloom, the pink stays the same. There's no variations in it. It doesn't, there's no light or dark or anything like that. So the grayscale in it does all the light and dark in it, but the pink remains the same, which I also think is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing about this comic that's different from Bloom is that the line work is very thin. Like, the lines are very thin. It feels much more precise and almost more grounded. It doesn't have the same kind of looseness and flexibility that Bloom does. Things feel a lot more, I don't want to say rigid, but it's definitely more grounded, like I said.
There's a lot more detail in it as well, especially in the backgrounds.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also liked how a lot of the story is written in Freddie's point of view while she was writing emails to the advice columnist. When she did that, the text boxes looked like the computer software window messages, and I thought that was kind of a cool way to have a text box in there that makes it different. You always knew when she was talking directly to the advice columnist, and it almost, like you said, like the Dear Rachel Maddow, it almost felt like a diary entry type thing, and I thought that was kind of a cool idea. I also like different ethnicities, body types, ages, and sexualities, which is really cool to see also, especially in a YA.
Yeah, I think Bloom feels like, although, Ari doesn't really seem like he's openly gay. I mean, his parents seem to know, his friends definitely know, but he doesn't really ever talk about it.
True.
And Hector, of course, he doesn't talk about it much either. Ari finds out that he's gay because he overhears a conversation about Hector breaking up with somebody named Andrew, who is a very male name, but it definitely has more of a small town feel. Like, all of his friends are pretty much assumed straight.
Right.
But in Laura Dean, it definitely is a bigger city. There seems to be a lot more going on, and so the reflection of the other characters in that, it is reflected in those other characters that it's a more diverse cast, and there's kind of bigger things happening and more things happening.
Right. I agree.
So I wanted to actually talk for just a minute about the idea of likability. So, I really enjoy these books. I really love the stories. I think they're important. They're interesting. The characters are really interesting. But for a lot of both Bloom and Laura Dean, I don't necessarily like the main characters. Both Ari and Freddie are pretty messy. They're kind of assholes to the people that matter the most. And so I was thinking about, does a character have to be likable in order to root for them? There's a lot of people who are really into villains, which I think is a slightly different thing, to really be into the characters that are actively trying to do bad things. But if a character doesn't necessarily make good decisions, like, what is it about these books that make you want the main characters to succeed?
I don't know. I think it's because they're very obviously human. Like, they're making bad decisions, and I feel like that's also relatable. Like, as much as you're like, that's not great, and I wish that wasn't happening and you were doing something better, I think we can all relate to times in our lives when we've done something similar or something that's different but still was not a great choice, and there were consequences for it, and now because of hindsight, we already know where that's going. So in some ways, when you're rooting for them, it's almost like you're rooting for them to figure out what they're not doing right and make the better decisions, and I feel like that does happen, and that kind of is when you're like, oh, yay. Yeah,
I think it definitely makes a difference when the story ends, because if both of these stories had ended sooner, so if Freddie ended up going to Laura's party and stayed there, and if Ari had blamed Hector for the bakery burning, and it ended there, like we wouldn't have any sympathy for the characters.
Right.
You know, I think, like you said, we get a chance to see them rectify their mistakes and make amends and become better people. And I think that's what's so frustrating about what's going on in the world today, because I think there's people out there who we are invested in. We may not necessarily find them likable, but we want to know, we find out they've done something bad and we want to see them do better. And sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. And so I think the idea of likability has to be, there has to be a time frame, you know?
Right.
In which you can make that assessment. Of course, there are characters in books, in TV shows, in movies that have like shown up and I've immediately been like, nope, I hate you. And I'm reading a Star Wars novel right now, and there's a character in it that I don't like because she's very rude, like she doesn't really seem to care about everything, and she just has this really harsh way of acting, and she's part of the New Republic. But I'm also interested in what's going to happen with her because she's surrounded by people who are better, who I think will influence her to become different. So I think both it's a time frame thing and also who are these people surrounding themselves with.
True.
Because when you surround yourself with people who are not good people, you're never going to really... I'm never really going to relate to you.
Right.
Like, sorry, Trump supporters. Like, I, believe in every human life is sacred, but I'm never going to actively try to become friends with somebody like that.
Right.
But I went to a political rally when I was in Portland for Andrew Yang, which was a very interesting thing, and there was a guy there who had voted for Trump and who was like, I made a mistake. This was not the right decision. I'm here now to like try and change and try and make things better.
That's good.
And that's a person that I could be like, yes, you are doing the right thing now. So yeah.
Now you're actually making America better again. See?
Right? Yeah. So I think it's really...
By changing.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's interesting to see these kind of stories in which the characters aren't necessarily super likable or the most charming. I mean, look at Han Solo. He's not really a great dude.
Yeah.
But he surrounds himself with people who do the right thing that influence him to be better. So I think, that's why we kind of connect to these characters, because like you said, they're very relatable. We've all been there. We've all done those stupid things. And to see those people become better, I think inspire us to surround ourselves with good people.
Yeah, and I think because it's so relatable, it also reminds you that, you can always change.
Yes.
No matter what mistakes you've made, you can always stop and start making better mistakes and try to atone for that in some ways. I think also the reason why this hits home a little bit for me, too, especially with these being YA, is because I'm an elementary teacher. So, my students are so vast and different, and, every day is a challenge and every day is a different adventure. But, I mean, there are certainly students that are more difficult than others and that don't make great decisions and don't behave the way we would like them to behave. But, I can't judge them, and I can't automatically be like, well, you're the villain. Like
they're kids.
Yeah, so it's like, I find no matter how difficult the situation and no matter how difficult the student and no matter their decisions, I root for them still, even when they're not being respectful or they're not doing what I would like them to be doing or making the better choices. I root for them and hope that they will eventually see that and do what needs to be done. And so, and I think when I read these stories or watch things that have those story or those characters that aren't necessarily likable, my mind kind of shifts into that of like, well, I mean, I don't want to say that some of my students are not likable, but I mean, there's definitely situations where, I wish things were different, and but I mean, I can't just give up on them and just be like, well, sorry,
Yeah. you blew it.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, you know, having to learn to look at the less likable characters and still root for them and hope for them.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed these books. Like I said, we would highly recommend them. They're both published by First Second. You can absolutely get them at your local library. That's how I read them first, in the YA section, as we've said before.
Mm-hmm. And I think they're a great combination for good contrast of relationships. So, you know, of love and breakups and all those fun things that we all go through. So, on that note... This has been another exciting episode of File 741. I'm Leigh.
And I'm Beckah.
Thank you for listening, and please like us on Facebook or follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can tune into all of our podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, YouTube, or at thefeminerdfiles.net.